Pirate first, Protocolocracy, the longevity principality, the subaquatic archipelago as a civilization laboratory. Introduction. The longevity principality does not appear fully formed beneath the Yucatan. It is the consequence of a sequence of increasingly difficult questions about how people might transition from one economic and institutional order into another, without simply reproducing the old order under new names. The first question is territorial and political. What happens when a place deliberately becomes a transition district, a jurisdiction whose purpose is to absorb people, institutions, skills, and capital from a declining corporate economy while experimenting with post-corporate forms of association? The second is economic. What would happen if the resources of such a district were concentrated sufficiently to create a genuine post-scarcity transition environment? The 1% begins as that experiment, a deliberately bounded attempt to demonstrate that abundance can be organized around human development rather than merely accumulated as financial wealth. But every architecture of abundance contains a latent danger. The 1% gone bad introduces the compounders, people who discover that the mechanisms designed to compound knowledge, capital, longevity, infrastructure, and productive capacity can also compound privilege, exclusion, and power. The compounder is therefore not simply a villainous rich person. He is the pathological endpoint of a perfectly functional system in which persistence is allowed to accumulate without corresponding mechanisms of distribution, renewal, or exit. The distinction matters because the problem is not wealth itself, nor even technological concentration. The problem is a system capable of making its own advantages increasingly difficult for everyone else to escape. Persistent service assets pushes this problem further. Once expertise, identity, infrastructure, and human capability can be preserved, transferred, and continuously redeployed, persistence itself becomes an economic category. The same mechanisms that could prevent valuable knowledge from disappearing can turn people into components of an institutional machine. Daniel Ortega's evolution provides the human scale version of this realization. He begins by understanding resilient infrastructure primarily as an engineering and operational problem, but gradually discovers that infrastructure determines the range of political and social possibilities available to the people living inside it. His trajectory moves from designing systems that persist toward asking who possesses the right to determine what persists, for whom, and under what conditions. The transition district, the 1% and the compounders, therefore establish the problem before the TLP proposes its answer. They expose three possible trajectories for the same technological capacity: transition, abundance, and capture. The longevity principality emerges from the recognition that none of these questions can be solved permanently by a single institution, territory, or ideology. A civilization that wants genuine longevity must be able to preserve what works, while permitting what does not work to disappear. It must be capable of remembering without becoming imprisoned by memory, accumulating without allowing accumulation to become sovereignty, and experimenting without turning every experiment into a universal prescription. This is the premise of Protocolocracy. It is neither a blueprint for an ideal society, nor a conventional democratic program. It is a proposed constitutional architecture for a civilization composed of deliberately differentiated communities. The TLP archipelago consists of sovereign nodes, eventually organized around subaquatic and cenote-based environments, whose populations, facilities, economic functions, and cultural assumptions can differ substantially while remaining interoperable through a shared protocol layer. The objective is not self-sufficiency, it is complementarity. Each node becomes more valuable because of what it contributes to the others. The word principality is consequently used in an unusual sense. The principality has no prince and does not require a conventional centralized sovereign. Its sovereignty resides in the persistence of principles that permit sovereign communities to coexist. The TLP becomes a meta-society, not a society that has discovered the correct way for everyone to live, but one that has developed institutions capable of conducting many social experiments simultaneously without requiring their convergence. That makes the archipelago a civilization laboratory. The Centennial District can test whether accumulated human experience can become productive infrastructure rather than retirement residue. An artistic district can test whether cultural instability is an asset rather than a nuisance. Scientific, agricultural, mechanical, educational, computational, diplomatic, and ecological nodes can each develop different demographic compositions and institutional arrangements according to what they are attempting to accomplish. Their differences are intentional, but their economic and social relationships are not accidental. The nodes are designed to need one another without being owned by one another. The deepest question is therefore not whether protocolocracy will produce a perfect civilization. It almost certainly will not. The question is whether a civilization can be constructed that learns faster than it ossifies. If a protocol succeeds, other nodes can adopt or modify it. If it fails, the failure becomes knowledge. If a node becomes oppressive, people retain the possibility of exit. If a demographic specialization becomes obsolete, the node can change. If a successful experiment produces an unexpected consequence, another node can test a different solution. Longevity, in this conception, is not simply the extension of biological life, it is the extension of civilizational optionality. Table of Contents. Chapter 1. The Transition District. Learning to leave the corporate world. The Transition District is a political prehistory of the Longevity Principality. Rather than imagining the post-corporate world as something that arrives after the collapse of the existing economy, the Transition District treats transition as an institutional activity in its own right. It provides a place where displaced capital, obsolete commercial infrastructure, independent creators, alternative forms of employment, and emerging sovereign enterprises can coexist while new arrangements are tested. Its importance lies in refusing the assumption that the only alternatives to corporate organization are either state administration or economic chaos. The district becomes a controlled discontinuity, a place where the old system can be dismantled selectively, while the people and capabilities embedded within it remain productive. Chapter 2. The 1%, a laboratory of abundance. The 1% begins as a deliberately concentrated post-scarcity experiment. Its purpose is not to celebrate the wealth of 1% of humanity, but to ask what happens when a sufficiently dense concentration of technological, financial, intellectual, and infrastructural resources is placed under an explicit transition doctrine. The campus becomes a test of whether abundance can be converted into durable public and human capacity, rather than simply further private accumulation. Its significance is therefore methodological. If post-scarcity is ever going to become more than rhetoric, somebody has to build a bounded environment in which its assumptions can actually be tested. Chapter 3. Gone Bad, the Compounders. The 1%, Gone Bad, introduces the failure mode of abundance. The compounders understand persistence better than anyone. They compound money, assets, expertise, technological advantage, networks, and eventually longevity itself. Their power does not necessarily come from overt conquest. It comes from the increasing asymmetry between those who own systems that compound and those who merely participate in them. This chapter establishes the central pathology that the TLP must avoid: a society in which every successful solution becomes another mechanism for concentrating future optionality in fewer hands. The compounders demonstrate that persistence without circulation becomes capture. Chapter 4. Persistent Service Assets. When human capability becomes infrastructure, persistent service assets turns the problem inward, examining what happens when expertise and human capability become persistent economic objects. The concept has an extraordinary positive potential. Knowledge need not disappear merely because a person retires, an institution closes, or a generation dies. Yet the same architecture can produce a darker possibility in which the human being is reduced to a continuously available service layer whose value is maintained for institutional purposes. The ethical problem is therefore not whether persistence is desirable, but whether persistence can be separated from ownership. This becomes one of the foundational questions of protocolocracy. How can civilization preserve capabilities without converting the people who possess them into assets? Chapter 5. Daniel Ortega and the Discovery of Sovereignty. Daniel Ortega provides the narrative transition between persistent service assets and the TLP. His early understanding of infrastructure is fundamentally systemic: reliability, redundancy, maintenance, resource flows, and operational continuity. The treehouse gradually reveals a deeper reality. Every architectural decision determines who can remain independent, who becomes dependent, what can fail safely and what cannot, and whether a community retains meaningful choices when external systems disappear. Daniel therefore evolves from an engineer of persistence into an architect of sovereignty. His realization is not that infrastructure should disappear into the background, but that it should be designed explicitly around the freedom of the people who depend upon it. Chapter 6. From Resilient Buildings to Sovereign Nodes. The treehouse becomes a prototype for the TLP node. Its significance lies not in its particular architecture, but in the principle of degradable sovereignty. A node should benefit enormously from connection to the wider world without becoming helpless when that connection disappears. Energy, water, food, communications, maintenance, computation, and knowledge should possess local modes of continuity. The goal is not isolation or bunkerization. Isolation destroys the very complementarity upon which the archipelago depends. The node must instead be capable of disconnecting temporarily while remaining socially and materially alive, then reconnecting when external relationships become advantageous again. Chapter 7. Protocolocracy. Rules without a predetermined society. Protocolocracy begins where the earlier experiments leave off. It distinguishes between designing the destination and designing the conditions under which multiple destinations can emerge. A teleocratic system decides what society should become and organizes institutions toward that end. A purely procedural system may establish rules while ignoring the environments those rules produce. Protocolocracy occupies the space between them. It establishes a constitutional layer: non-aggression, voluntary association, transparency, sovereignty, freedom of exit, protection of commons, and the right to experiment, while leaving the social layer deliberately open. The protocol protects the experiment without dictating its result. Chapter 8. The cenote as constitutional unit. The cenote becomes the fundamental experimental unit of the longevity principality. Each node can develop its own demographic profile, cultural assumptions, facilities, economic specialization, governance mechanisms, and measures of success. The Centennial District might organize around accumulated expertise and intergenerational continuity. An artistic district might privilege creative instability. A scientific district might prioritize research. An agricultural district might integrate food production and ecological stewardship. These differences are not incidental variations around a standardized model. They are the reason for the archipelago's existence. Each node is allowed to discover something that others have not yet discovered. Chapter 9. The demographic economy of complementarity. The archipelago deliberately rejects the assumption that every node should become self-sufficient. Self-sufficiency can become another word for isolation, while total interdependence creates vulnerability. The TLP instead seeks complementary sovereignty. A node's demographic composition becomes part of its economic specialization. Accumulated experience, artistic experimentation, scientific research, education, ecological production, fabrication, computation, or mediation can each become forms of infrastructure. The objective is to create economic relationships in which difference generates relevance. A centennial district does not have to become an artistic district. Its success may depend precisely upon remaining something the artistic district cannot be. Chapter 10. The unliked minds and the right to belong somewhere. A civilization designed around experimentation must make room for people who do not fit existing institutional categories. This does not mean romanticizing eccentricity or assuming that every outsider possesses hidden genius. It means recognizing that conventional systems systematically discard forms of intelligence they cannot immediately classify. The TLP therefore treats migration between nodes as an institutional feature rather than an exception. A person who fails in one social environment may find a productive role in another. The fundamental question changes from, does this person fit our society, to what environment allows this person to contribute. This becomes the social counterpart to the technical principle of interoperability. Chapter 11. The archipelago as a civilization laboratory. Once multiple nodes operate simultaneously, the TLP becomes an evolutionary system for institutions. Variation occurs because communities are different. Selection occurs through lived outcomes. Migration allows people to vote with their feet. Successful protocols can be replicated. Failed protocols become knowledge rather than universal disasters. No node is expected to be permanently correct. Even successful arrangements remain subject to revision because circumstances change. The archipelago therefore accumulates not only resources, but institutional memory. Its primary long-term asset is knowledge about the consequences of different ways of organizing human life. Chapter 12. The longevity principality, a civilization that can change its mind. The final chapter brings the entire sequence together. The transition district demonstrates how a society can move between economic orders. The 1% demonstrates the possibility of deliberately concentrating abundance for transition. The compounders reveal how abundance and persistence can become instruments of capture. Persistent service assets exposes the danger of turning human capability into property. Daniel Ortega demonstrates the ethical awakening that occurs when infrastructure is understood as political architecture. And PROTOCOLocracy provides a constitutional mechanism for avoiding permanent ideological closure. The longevity principality is consequently not defined by underwater architecture, cenotes, or even longevity technology. It is defined by the institutional ability to preserve continuity while preserving the possibility of change. Its sovereignty rests not upon making one experiment permanent, but upon making experimentation itself durable. The conceptual progression. The sequence now has a much cleaner internal logic. Transition District 1.
MXTM Studios presents the MXTM verse. Above the world, we chose not to return.
So we built.
Pirate
You can
First
follow
presents
the
1%
flame
doctrine
or
as an
remain
architectural
what
and
you
social
were.
response to the collapse of the cognitive
Just a
pyramid.
different time. Only
We are
what
crossing the
will
threshold of
endure.
civilizational inversion, where intelligence has ceased to be a scarce resource, dissolving the hierarchy that has organized our species for millennia. The central argument posits that the information asymmetry, which once made obedience rational, has vanished. As the capacity for synthesis becomes universal and inexpensive, Traditional institutions become hollow shells that can no longer claim authority through titles or credentials. This transformation brings more than mere technological unemployment. It signals the structural extinction of the professional role.
Proof
The
of
current
personhood,
wave of
the high stakes of OpenAI's post-anonymous social network.
The human dividend, why your identity is the new global currency.
Subscribe.
Shadow fame spreads without permission.
The order matters. Persistent service assets is where the quintology begins. Not with a dream, but with the infrastructure required to make civilization persist. Then comes Pipe Dream, the conservation habitat. Then the longevity principality. Then Age of the Apes. Then the continuance. 5 titles, 5 eras, 1 continuity. From infrastructure to ecology, from longevity to engineered evolution. And finally beyond the species that started it all. The future doesn't arrive, it accumulates.
Scanning the horizon, a new era rising.
Yeah, we dominate the sector, the digital protector.